welcome to our first edition of Data Chats. My name is Nick Buck, I'm the CEO of Seqvoia, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Noel Fessey, who's the CEO of EFA. And today we've chosen to talk about the fund prospectus, and clearly that is a very topical topic today in the fund industry, linking the fund prospectus to data. So my first question for you, Noel, and first of all, thank you for accepting to be here.
Pleasure.
My first question would be the following. What exactly is the fund prospectus? Is it a novel with sequels, or is it something else? And if it is something else, what would it be?
Well, I suppose the technical answer, or the appropriate answer, is that the prospectus is the defining document for the fund, so it describes the fund. But let's not deal with the semantics. Let's talk about it. What it is I think it's a witness to the data in the fund, to the if you like, the design, the construction, the skeleton, the flesh even of the fund. About how do we express that in a way which communicates that to customers, but also to competent authorities, to intermediaries, and also to the operating divisions of the asset management firm that's promoting the fund. So in a sense, the way that I look at a prospectus, and always have looked at one, is really as a data set, not as a document. The document is the consequence of the data set. And therefore, when compiling a prospectus, when conceiving of it in the first instance, you may have the product development people who have their concept of the investment proposition that's going to be wrapped inside the fund. But by the time it's being prepared and written as a prospectus, then ideally that should follow if you like, a data assembly, a document assembly approach based upon data, rather than a document that you write in Microsoft Word. And Microsoft Word is probably still the dominant technology that people use to prepare a prospectus.
Okay, so you've really now given us what I would call a data perspective, and also an operational perspective, a mindfulness of all of the other stakeholders in the fund value chain. Do you feel that your view of the sort of the data importance of the prospectus is widely shared in the fund industry? Do you feel that there's still I would say a legacy of looking at this document as an isolated process, a legalistic document? And that would be my first question. And then there's this second question around governance. If I take your definition or your intent of what it is, who should own it?
Well, so let's be clear about first of all, a prospectus is not the only document relevant to the definition and preparation of an investment fund product. So the prospectus is, in my view, perhaps the most important one, not necessarily in the legislator's view. So in the European sphere, for example, the key investor document key information document has become probably the dominant, considered perhaps the most important offering document. But it's in the prospectus are very closely related, and indeed are supposed to be coherent. And if there are any differences, they're not supposed to be material. But the matter is, I think that the prospectus tends more towards, upon first inspection, to be if you like, a legal composition. But if you speak to asset managers, you'll find that perhaps the best description, it's a shared product. But sometimes you see inside asset managers maybe a debate is be an appropriate way to put it, of whether the prospectus is a legal document or a product document. And for me, my bias would probably be towards product owning it principally, the legal input being absolutely important and valid, but essentially the document owner is probably the product developer or the head of the product division, if there is such a thing inside the asset manager. And then there are a multitude of stakeholders around prospectuses, and indeed all sorts of product-oriented documentation. So not least the legal team, but then also the investment team, the distribution team, the compliance, the risk, the marketing teams. So they all have an interest, they all have an input, and none of them is necessarily preeminent or dominant But the true home of the prospectus, in my view, is the product development team,
yes.
not the legal team.
Yeah, I believe that to be the case. Clearly, would you, and you've alluded to the UCITS kit, the introduction of the UCITS kits in 2012, that clearly opens up the Pandora box, because there you have the first iteration of a disclosure document that would be mass produced, as opposed to a fact sheet that is very much still a marketing document. And I often see that regulation has really driven this discussion around the prospectus. We see that now on SFDR, again, their pre-contractual disclosure, that almost reluctantly the industry is being pushed into this question of looking at this prospectus as something different. You've also alluded to the challenge of consistency. Maybe you could expand on how does it all fit together? Where does it start, and is there no real starting point, and they are all produced at the same time?
Well, maybe it's because of my experience that when in the early years of my time in the industry, the prospectus was the principal document, the most important offering document, and I think the introduction of other point of sales materials, which in a sense have precedence, are regarded by legislators as being more important because they're more likely to be read. They have, to some degree, those legislative initiatives have to some degree diminished the main prospectus, but it's still nonetheless very important, because if you really want to understand the fund in the detail, including some of its key risks, then you're going to have to go to the main prospectus to find those disclosures. But again, I don't think these are necessarily in competition, and I do think it kind of comes back to they're certainly related. They're born from a coherent, integrated product development process involving all of the key actors. And so the process by which a prospectus is drafted should be the same as the process by which a KID is drafted, with all of the key stakeholders involved. And then for me, the most important thing, again, it comes back to that drafting process, that preparation process. Inevitably, a large part of that is still done in Word, or it may be done even in PowerPoint, or it may be done in conversation around a table. But at some point, the principles within those documents, the definitions of the product, need to be expressed clearly and concisely in writing. And one of my key points here then is that the appropriate tool for that is not a word processor. So the appropriate tool for that is effectively some form of content management system, which allows the development process to capture those definitions, to record them, to store them, to control their configuration, and to control how they are then extracted and compiled together in whatever the target object or target document is. So if it's a full prospectus, then you're selecting a set of data appropriate to that. But if it's the key investor information document, the KID, then it's a subset of the data, or maybe even a superset or a slightly different set. But there is a very strong intersection between those two data sets. And the reason to say that this is best done inside some form of appropriate tool rather than ab initio in a word processor is that tool then provides you with the framework for governing not only the inception but also the ongoing management, the evolution of the product in a way that Microsoft Word or no Microsoft product does. And you also see spreadsheets being used also as databases inside product development processes. And there's one thing about them, they're certainly convenient, and that's why we call it the Microsoft adhocracy. It's really easy to pick up a word processor or a spreadsheet and start to create stuff. And almost everybody in the modern workplace has got some form of word processing skill at some level. Even if it's quite basic, they can still write text and create things. The difficulty with that is that you cannot control versions, and so you what you end up with, and there's if you think about, let's step back. Why are we talking about data tools? And we're talking about them because the route by which information embedded in the prospectus finds its way into an operating business is through an extraction process. And if the prospectus is created and maintained in Word and Word alone, then the configuration control process for that word processor document is probably a version number as a sort of suffix in the name of the file, stored inside a network storage file management system. And the problem with that is that relies upon the diligence of the human process to make sure that you don't, well, firstly, you faithfully edit the appropriate version and that you correctly mark up that you've created an additional version, and then you hand it over to the legal team, for example, for presentation to the regulator and subsequent approval, and then over to the operations team for data extraction and operation. And it's at that point, particularly if we take the data extraction and operation point, which is the point where in my history I first started to introduce technology into prospectus management, that you get basic errors coming in to transposition. So someone reads the prospectus and transfers the data into the production systems, they make mistakes.
Yes, copy paste.
Yeah, copy paste or transposition or omission or what have you. And then that would lead to, for example, the wrong management fee being applied to a product in the accounting process, or the wrong initial charge being applied if an initial charge is relevant.
Because information is massively important to all the players in the fund value chain, whether it's product dissemination,
yes,
fund admin system, custody, etc.
Yeah, and a prospectus is a data-intensive document.
Yes.
And even if you look at the text, it is essentially a collection of often textual, but sometimes tabular data, and even the textual data are important, and it's important that you understand the version control of that object as it moves from one version of the prospectus to the next. Or the performance fee data will be important because it will contain some threshold, some benchmark.
Often expressed in a sentence, and that's the challenge.
And I think that the challenge then is people's familiarity and comfort with word processors, with Microsoft Word, for example, is at odds with the corporation's need to be in control, and also for the corporation's need to be efficient in the translation into the production process. And for the control point, it's to be able to say to your internal control functions, this was the configuration of the fund in its prospectus and in its operation at a given point in time, and we did operate it faithfully in compliance with those instructions.
So you're even introducing the temporal side of data here.
Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely. And so that's
what was the operational reality at that given time.
Correct. And it's because asset managers have experienced those errors, those translation errors or transposition errors in the past, that they started to introduce technology for actually wrapping and controlling the prospectus. And it doesn't mean that Word is no longer available for people who are editing prospectuses. Indeed, some technology will allow you to check the document out, and it contains, because Word is effectively one large XML file, if you look underneath Word, technically speaking, then the object is checked out in the form of a word processor that people are familiar with. They can edit it. If they switch track changes on, they can check it back in, and the right tool set will then decompose that document back into its objects and tell you what changed. And you've got your config control all embedded in the tool, even if people have worked with some form of editor with which they're familiar. Now that's basic prospectus management, and that's right at the simple end of the product development and governance process. A much more of a challenge, I think, for our industry is saying, well, how can we take the learning points of what we've done in the prospectus space and in the KID and in the fact sheets, because they all kind of use the same document assembly and data mastering process, and then ask yourself, can we pull that up the value chain a little bit so that it's involved
product definition
earlier in the process around what is the product definition? So how do we describe our product as an investment process? How do we describe it to the extent if it's wrapped in some form of a container, if that's a mutual fund, or is it a securitization vehicle, or is it simply a segregated account? And then how do we define it in terms of what asset class is it? What's its objective? Does it have an outperformance objective? Is that absolute? Is that relative? Does it have some form of value preservation objective? How do we describe that? An interesting point for asset managers, and kind of coming back into the value point, or the sort of governance point, is that asset managers also have to be able to demonstrate value for money, in a sense, so that their products make sense in the real world. And so you can offer some form of relative return product and say, well, compared to the market, my product is fit for purpose, it's appropriate, it works, and therefore I can sell it. The value for money debate asks the question, but should you sell it? Because it may be it may be attractive relative to the other products that you describe as being competitors, but is it attractive to the customer? Is the customer going to benefit from owning this product? And that value for money discussion inside asset managers, it's a really important governance conversation, and it's absolutely part of the product definition. It's really important you track it, you define how you have that value for money conversation. And I would say it's not great for the long-term governance and memory, corporate memory of any company, to entrust that record-keeping process, or that value for money measurement definition process to a normal network file store, or even to some form of SharePoint system.
Yes.
Unless you wrap that with very significant controls that say, well, how stuff goes in and how it comes out and how we preserve and archive it is really very, very carefully thought through and controlled.
So, for the first part of our conversation, you have confirmed the need to look at the prospectus as a container of a great deal of very valuable data.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the reality of the asset management industry, if you were to benchmark the 100 largest asset managers in Europe and beyond, across all of their fund domiciles, all of their product, you would still say that, Word was still very prominent in that world today.
Well, that's a big ask, Nick. So to be clear, I haven't benchmarked 100 asset
managers.
No,
well, clearly we're in that space, but clearly.
So I would say it's very likely. So now, if the Word document is an artifact generated by the content management system or by the document assembly system, then that's perfectly appropriate.
No, I'm talking that Word is at the inception.
If Word is ab initio, the source of the prospectus, and it may well be, particularly, for example, if you've engaged a law firm to advise you,
yes,
then they won't have the document assembly system. Lawyers do use document assembly systems, but not for creating prospectuses for clients, in my experience.
Anyway. And here's my question. So clearly, you could argue that the product function within asset management is bereft of significant technology to accompany that product lifecycle process, and I think we could agree on that. What role do you see there for the regulator to play? The CSSF will probably by the end of this year or next year become much more, establish guidelines on what should be in a prospectus in a great deal more detail, how it should be structured. Do you see there that the regulator would have a role to play to bring the industry forward in that space? Is it a more forceful approach that would be needed? A bit like when the KID came. The KID was a
I was on that working group.
But it very much came from the regulator, from the Commission.
It came from the Commission, not from the regulator. Yes. So, and indeed, even before the Commission, there was to some degree a political agenda, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I don't think this is I wouldn't invite the regulator to intervene in here. I don't think there's some malfunction which the regulator, particularly in terms of product governance, the regulator needs to intervene on, because I think the regulator is already active. All regulators in all jurisdictions are already active in prospectus review, and I think it's within an asset manager's prerogative, I think, supported by advisors who may, often lawyers, including external lawyers. Rare is the asset manager. In fact, I would say there is no asset manager who would not consult externally in matters of law with the relevant specialists in the jurisdiction. So there are competent advisors. The asset management employees also are experienced and competent. I wouldn't invite the regulator to come in and say we should do more around how prospectus is produced. The regulator may, or the lawmakers may, say more if they wish about what the prospectus should contain.
But it could, and I know we're running out of time, but it could, also accelerate the filing process. So
I wouldn't say that the regulator should intervene, but I would say that asset managers can be a friend to their regulator.
Yes.
And to be a friend to your regulator, if you have a environment in which you have appropriate data configuration control,
you can show the changes.
And so this is one of the things that I've done in the past, working inside an asset manager. You check the prospectus out from your repository. You generate both a Word and a PDF copy with markup shown. The markup is shown by the machine, and what the markup is not the last markup your editor made, that is your product development colleague made. It's the markup showing the difference between the last filed prospectus, the last version you filed at the regulator, and this new version that you are now filing. And that's where you're a friend to your regulator.
Yeah.
Make it easy for your regulator and show him what you've changed compared to the last version he's seen. And get the machine to do that, because I can assure you that a machine-generated markup is far easier for the regulator to read than some of the drafts I've seen in the past, where it looks like a spider died on the page and wandered all over, because you know that track changes in Microsoft Word can look a real mess.
Yes.
But if the machine is generating it in both Word and PDF, it's much more coherent, almost serene. Your desk officer at the regulator is going to be much happier reviewing that draft, and confident, particularly if through your dialogue with them you say, look, this is a faithful copy markup of the last draft. They'll check themselves anyway, but they'll start to grow confident in you.
Yeah, that's very clear. One final thoughts from your side on product life cycle. And it seems to me other industries are very advanced, especially industrial players, automotive, space.
Yeah.
They really think about their products as being born, changing, and then being retired. You could say the fund industry is, funds are born, they're married, meaning the mergers, and then they cease to exist. Why is this topic so important for this industry today?
Well, I mean, let me say, I've been involved in those conversations where I mean more like car manufacturers or aircraft manufacturers or what have you. A fund is not a chocolate bar, so in a sense, it's not a simple product that you can create and run through a life cycle that way. In fact, no financial product is. And I think the issue comes down to the degree of abstraction. Mm-hmm. Financial products are really remarkably abstract. And I'm not saying that in a sense that I believe that investors can't understand them, because I think they can. But we sometimes forget how sophisticated our society is, and how at the sophisticated end of sophisticated financial services is. So even when we try to make funds appear simpler through key investor documents, for example, they're really encapsulating quite sophisticated ideas. And at the simplest end of it, it's buy equities, buy shares in companies. Mm-hmm. But when you look at funds that make significant use of derivatives, etc., that's quite abstract. So I think one of the challenges for the financial services industry in all of this sort of product development, life cycle management with all of its dimensions, so it's the distribution voice, it's the investment voice, it's the compliance voice, it's the development voice itself, it's the risk, it's the legal, all of that, and then all the benchmarks, all the asset classes, all the possible flavors of wrap, the jurisdictions, the marketing rules, all of these things. It's multidimensional, it's moving all the time. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the other challenges inside asset management is that there isn't necessarily a single coherent, powerful seat of that process. Because all of those actors who are involved in it, they all have their own systems, they all have their own ideas. And so you end up with what is naturally quite a distributed process. And so if you try to bring all that together, and by the way, on the distributed side, the adhocracy, Microsoft wins, really easy, everybody can use Microsoft Excel, etc. You try and bring that, and I've seen product definitions that are just great big long Excel files, and do you know what? They work to a point.
Yes.
It's the transposition point and the governance point that becomes...
The translation into the model.
Yeah, so you try and bring all that together into a world where you've kind of got this coherent, so that the governance mind is calm and says, yeah, I know it's all in one place and it's well managed. And if you're not careful about how you do that, then you'll end up with a rigid, difficult to operate bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. So in other words, it looks good on paper, and this is often what we complain about in terms of some of the regulatory agenda. Yeah, nice idea, but in reality it doesn't work. So trying to take some of these really great ideas and some of the progress that the industry has made around prospectus type technology, data management master, product master technology, and back that up out of document assembly and much earlier in the process into product development and governance, so that you get this.
Yeah, why do we launch this product?
Yeah, that's more difficult to do. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but I think the industry, and it is moving that way, and it should move that way progressively, and not try to build some form of. And I have seen companies try to sell monolithic products. And the problem is that it just boggles the mind. It's too difficult for an asset manager to grasp, and asset management firms are sophisticated firms, but it's just too much, and it dreams too much that you
too much at the same time.
Too much at the same time.
Yes.
And so the cost of entry, not only in terms of acquiring the technology but actually integrating it, it goes into the too difficult box. So you've got to walk the idea and the tool set progressively towards.
It's an incremental approach.
10, 20 years. So, but start now. Start now.
Well, that's a relief.
Yes.
Okay. Well, on this hopeful note, thank you, Noel, for this.
Did we cover that? Was that okay?
Yes, I think.
Yeah, no more regulation. Nick.
No more regulation. 10 to 20 years to digitalize this whole process.
With all due respect to the regulators,
yes.
But we've kind of got a lot to eat at the moment.
Okay. And we're
done.
To the audience, I hope you found that as enjoyable, as informative as I did. Thank you again, Noel. And we'll be back soon for another episode.